Hey everybody, welcome to Happy Dog Takes on the World. My name's Sean Watterson. I am one of the owners at the Happy Dog, and we have tried to create continuity with our Happy Dog Takes on the World series, and we are glad that we are able to come to you live, virtually, online, and look forward to being back in person, hopefully soon. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I just want to thank our partners in putting this program together, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies, International Partners in Mission, and of course the City Club. And big thanks to Stephanie Jansky of the City Club for everything she does to make this possible. And our media partner, IdeaStream, and our incomparable moderator, Tony Ganser. Thank you to Tony and to IdeaStream for participating in this program. So with that, cheers, and I'll turn it over to Tony.
Thanks so much, Sean. Hello and welcome to our virtual Happy Dog Takes on the World series. I am Tony Ganser, afternoon host for Northeast Ohio NPR station, WCPN IdeaStream. I'm also having internet problems, so if I start to get a little glitchy, it's not on purpose. It's just part of our world now. Our region is very aware of the myths and realities around so-called rust belts, places here and abroad that at one time housed global manufacturing giants and promised a decent middle-class life for workers. These industrial centers of the past seem to have seen their prominence and prosperity diminished by many factors, including companies seeking warmer climates and cheaper labor and tax liabilities in an ever more globalized world. Rust Belt communities face depopulation, vacancy, poverty, and the loss of community assets as the tax base erodes. In addition to a hollowing out of these communities' assets, many argue it's allowed a boon in political populism, a nationalism based on resentment, blame, and the yearning for the good old days. This phenomenon is not unique to the United States. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, and others have dealt with the decline of rust belts and a subsequent increase in populism with varying results. Tonight, we'll talk with national experts about the transatlantic effort to diminish the appeal of populism, revitalize Rust Belt economies, and restore democracy. We're joined by Dr. Jeffrey Anderson. He holds joint appointments in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service and Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's also the former director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies. Thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Also joining us is John Austin, director of the Michigan Economic Center, a center for ideas and network building to advance Michigan's economic transformation. He's also non-resident senior fellow for both the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Brookings Institution. Together, they authored the piece, How to Finally Defeat Populism, which appeared in the December 2020 issue of Foreign Policy. John, thanks also for being here.
Good to be back in Cleveland, sort of.
As in every City Club forum, you can participate with your questions, even if I'm delayed a little bit by my internet issues. You can text your questions to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can also tweet them at the City Club. Somehow they will make it to me and I will fit them in. So with that, let's begin. Let's start with that article that you guys penned for Foreign Policy. In it, you talk about Rust Belt regions becoming crucibles for neopopulism. First of all, can you explain maybe what neopopulism is as opposed to just good old populism? I don't know if, John, you want to go first and then Jeff?
And let me first say it is really a special treat to, with Clevelanders. My father, who may be tuning into Heckle, his son, grew up in Cleveland, and my grandfather was the last family president of the Austin Company, which grew in Cleveland, a design engineering company. And he'd take me to the City Club occasionally when I was a kid as special treats. We're seeing this rise in what no one expected, kind of populist movements that in a Western democracy we thought would remain kind of fringe or never win a majority. Those that are espousing a kind of nativism and nationalism and a bit of xenophobia and nostalgia for the good old days, not just here, but as you noted, in some of our Western democracies where Brexit was fueled by voters feeling left behind and loss of control in a changed world. And then we elected Trump, our states elected Trump, at least mine, with regions where white working class voters in communities that were still in decline and hadn't turned the corner were the ones who were responding to his nostalgia, nativism, and nationalism. But I think we need to make a distinction too, which the Europeans do, between kind of left-wing and right-wing populism. I think as Jeffrey and I will talk about, sort of economic conditions in your community and anxiety about economic change are the root causes of both forms. But folks like Bernie Sanders, for example, who I would consider a kind of left-wing progressive populist, they speak to the same types of anxieties, but they say, let's soak the rich and pay for solutions like education and free college and free healthcare and a decent paying job. Whereas the right-wing populists, both here and in Europe, folks like Trump, folks like Marine Le Pen in France, they play on the cultural fears. They sow fears of immigrants and fears of Black people, and somebody's getting theirs, or urban elites are taking advantage of you. So the populism that's most destructive, because it's kind of blowing up our democracies from within, is when demagogues feed this kind of right-wing populism that is all about pullback from the international community, rejection of people of different colors and backgrounds, and a nostalgia for a past where one's status as a white working class person was secure. So that's the populism we're concerned about.
Jeff?
Yeah, I wouldn't add much to that. Neo's a rather inartful term. You could probably call it, at least in Europe, populism 3.0. I mean, there have been instances of populist outbreaks going back to the 1950s. They're usually connected to economic difficulties, economic turndowns. In the 1990s in Germany and elsewhere, we saw a combination of economic difficulties combined with large movements of migrants as a result of the end of the Cold War. So what we're seeing since 2008 is in some ways nothing new, but in other ways especially worrisome, given how entrenched these populist parties, particularly on the right. John's absolutely correct. There are variants left and right. The ones that are in the ascendancy now in Europe and arguably here in the United States are the ones on the right.
Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the problem of causation versus correlation? Because we see the rise of similar populist figures in all of these countries that you mentioned and ones that we haven't mentioned, Hungary, for example. How do we know that this is all part of a unified movement, so to say, or are they individual opportunists in each of these political systems just trying to drum up votes and drum up power?
That's a great question, Tony. And I think your last comment really gets to the point. Populism is this very protean, malleable phenomenon. There's no single version of it, even within a single country. We like to talk about the demand side for populism and the supply side. The demand side are the people who, for whatever reason, and we're happy to talk about that as we get into the hour, turn to these kinds of appeals based on, and let's stick with the right-wing version here, based on nationalism, based on racism, xenophobia. They're demanding something in response to a change in circumstances that they're seeing. The supply side is where it gets creative. These are the political entrepreneurs who are looking to win power by appealing to as many voters, many disaffected voters as they can. And those combinations of demand and supply take different forms, not only across countries, but even within countries. And that's one reason we're quick to acknowledge that when we talk about populism in these former industrial powerhouses, that's not the only brand of populism out there. We can talk about the rural phenomena. We can talk about wealthy areas on the coasts where populism is Orange County, California, for example. So you have to be very careful about delineating what you're talking about, and that's why we're focusing on the intersection of territory, and specifically, I don't like the term Rust Belt, but it's a quick way of connoting what we're talking about. The intersection of Rust Belts and these populist phenomena.
Let me add, Tony, as we all know who live in the Midwest, it is Rust Belt no more. It's not a monolith of struggling old factory towns and cities. So many communities, large and small, that once were dominated by a signature industry or heavy manufacturing, have really turned an economic corner and are kicking it in a kind of globalized high-tech economy. Think of Minneapolis, St. Paul to the west, which was once the flour milling capital of the world, and Pittsburgh, had the collapse of the steel industry, but now it's back with AI and robotics, and it's thriving. Look at the Columbus and Cincinnati or university towns like where I am in Ann Arbor, they're killing it and have thriving economies. But we still have a lot of these particularly small and medium-sized factory and mill towns that have lost their anchors, where folks have successfully turned an economic corner. They're not going for this nostalgia and nativism, and they're not the Trump supporting voters. It's where you're still in a hollowed out community that wasn't what it used to be, and you're still anxious about the future for yourself and your kids. That's where the Trump voters here, but it's also where the populist supporters in the UK are. Communities in the North and Midlands that are manufacturing centers like Manchester that are thriving anew, they didn't vote for Brexit. And you see the same pattern in Germany and the Ruhrgebiet, they're iron and steel and coal country. Communities that are doing well again are not going for the AFT, the populist right wing party, and nearly the same support as others. So there is this link between accelerating economic condition and creating space for folks to be kind of optimistic and forward looking, and not susceptible to this backward-looking and nativist and afraid of the world mentality that opportunists in politics sell and prey on.
So I've just begun this book. It's called Trade Wars are Class Wars, and it's by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis, and they're connecting class and trade wars as the title lets on. But early in the book, it makes sure to say all this attention on China, for example, during the trade war and the increase in tariffs during the Trump era, that even within China, there are class wars, that, there are areas of the country, industrialized areas of the country, which are not seeing the same amount of wealth which is flowing to the top of that economy, just as many complain about in the United States. So I wonder, Jeff, maybe if you could start talking about how we get to racism, how we get to nationalism when there are legitimate concerns about inequality and legitimate concerns about investment in communities, both here and abroad. It seems like there's a common story playing out. And I don't really understand how we get to racism when we're talking about, this vast divide in wealth and investment in communities. Right.
No, that's a key point. I'll speak about the European experience, which I know best. And the story goes back to the 1970s, where with the OPEC shocks and the first real kind of challenge to the growth model and the growth example that was going on in the post-war period in Europe. What you see at that point is a growing political divide between a kind of market-oriented, what we call a neoliberal revolution. Here in this country, it was Ronald Reagan that spearheaded that. In Europe, it was largely Margaret Thatcher in the UK, but she had a lot of followers throughout the continent. And what happens over the course of the next 10 or 15 years is that the social democratic left in particular in Europe kind of seeds the ground and ends up adopting many of the tenets of the neoliberal orthodoxy. And, so my feeling is that the fact that we don't tend to think of these conflicts in class terms, but in some sense enable others to redefine them in terms of race, in terms of anti-immigrant attitudes and the like, blaming others for our economic problems. That's the failure of the center left in Europe, and I would argue even here in the United States. Although I think with this administration, we're beginning to see inklings of a rediscovery of the kind of clarion role that a moderate but distinctly left party can play in reshaping how we think about these key issues.
And I'd say
John,
in the American context, I was going to say in
go
the
ahead,
American
John.
context,
There's a little
we
delay.
have we have a long tradition of race-based needing someone to look down on or be better than, dating back to the poor whites in the South were recruited to side with the wealthy planters, even though they were getting extorted or abused as almost as bad, not nearly as bad as the African Americans, sharecroppers, because particularly under stress and economic stress, folks want somebody or will respond to the suggestion that there's somebody who you're better than, that you can look down on. And when working class whites, say in Flint, Michigan, are doing pretty well, putting on the table, being able to afford a boat and a cottage, and they're less threatened by both immigrants and their own loss of economic status, perceived or real, vis-a-vis African Americans and immigrants. And it's relatively easy when folks are under stress or feeling anxious about their future for, again, kind of racist demagogues to say, and this is what we've seen very clearly here, and also I would imagine in Europe, but ours is much more kind of black, white, people of color, race driven. Look, it's those folks, it's those African Americans or immigrants who are getting something they don't deserve, they don't work for at your expense. And that's, of course, not true, but that's what folks are telling folks, working class whites whose lives aren't exactly what they hoped they would be, or they're anxious about their future and the future for their kids. Understandably anxious, when many of them have been dislocated from good paying jobs that didn't require any education, in the case of some of the line jobs in our great factories. But the answer is not to tell them to blame these other folks. Say, oh, here's the skills and the education we will give you, so that you can get a good paying job, which there are lots of. Programming the robot, not mindlessly sticking something on a fender.
Our first question, John, from the audience is asking you to talk a little more about your research into the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, the so-called German Rust Belt, and what the U.S. might learn from the German transformation of that region.
Yeah, I was on an international study trip with folks from other countries who were looking at this very topic. And I focused myself on, how to accelerate economic transition and change in the Midwest and speed it up for the benefit of our people. But in Germany, we saw, a region that is really reminiscent of, Ohio and Michigan, and even closer to kind of the Western Pennsylvania coal and steel region. Lots of little communities that once relied on their machine making, iron, coal, and steel production. I mean, that's the region that powered Germany's, war machine and their heavy industry for generations. The Germans have a different kind of federal approach we don't have anything close to. They have a commitment in their constitution to say every German deserves an equal opportunity at a decent life wherever they live in this country. They have a long bipartisan tradition or nonpartisan tradition of, as does the EU policy. Let's organize to level up, in the British terminology, or to support the successful economic transition of regions like the Ruhrgebiet from old to new. So they do things that are very long term in planning. They build new research Fraunhofer institutes in these old industrial regions as kind of fulcrums for new innovation and new business development. They manage the transition of workers, supporting both buyouts, relocation, but more importantly, kind of retraining from those who worked in those old industries to new industries like clean energy. They do spend a lot of resources on helping their communities move out of dirty, polluting, regimes in their businesses and in their offices, and become kind of models of clean, green communities, which they are developing. So they have a commitment and a kind of a longer term strategy that we can learn a lot from, that you can organize sort of systematically efforts to support this transition from the kind of dirty old economy to the smart, clean economy of the future, and help your workers, your communities navigate that successfully. It's not perfect, and there are things that they can't do that we do a lot better, like how do you support innovation and new business startups out of the research and development, because you can't plan that. It's chaotic entrepreneurs and financiers, taking the new invention that comes out of the Cleveland Clinic and turning it into a new, medical device. We do that a heck of a lot better than anybody, but that's what they can learn from us, perhaps.
Extending our time in Germany, as well as the Ruhrgebiet, of course, you have the former GDR, Jeff, and you have, I think it's billions, if not trillions of euros, which have flowed into the eastern part of the country, which after unification, there was a recommitment to that region, which was not invested in as the West was. And still, when you see glimmers of hope, I reported from Germany for a year, and I was in Switzerland after that. You see glimmers of hope. I visited a Bombardier factory, which was creating trains and trams. It was a fantastic operation. But when you still look at unemployment, and you also look at the number of people who are voting for the AfD, Alternative for Germany party, and are staying right wing because they still feel forgotten. What does that say? Does it say we just need to redouble efforts, or is there something else going on?
It says a couple of things. I mean, the former GDR is a textbook case of rapid deindustrialization. With the decision to basically transfer the entire political, institutional, and economic apparatus of West Germany to East Germany in 1990. It was literally just a matter of months before that economy collapsed, and hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs, many of them, relatively speaking, high-paying, high-status manufacturing jobs, just disappeared. And it's no accident that we're also looking at the part of Germany where support for the AfD is the highest, support for this populist party is the highest, where attitudes about foreigners and about Muslims and so on are the most extreme in Germany. The region almost proves our point in a way, in a much more compressed time frame than occurred here in the United States. But I think, to your point, what it suggests is that any policy, any initiative that is going to be undertaken to try to essentially unwind the effects of 40 years of industrial decline, 10 years of financial crisis shock, 5 years of conditioning through right-wing media and right-wing politicians to blame the other for your problems. It's a long-term project. And it's certainly going to be a longer-term project than an election cycle, which is why we need to get institutions on the ground. We need to get buy-in from people who live and work in these areas. This can't be a top-down initiative in any way, shape, or form. I mean, one of the brilliant dimensions of European Union policy, as John pointed out, everything that's done in the Ruhrgebiet is kind of under this umbrella of the EU. The EU has been very good at devising schemes that, in a sense, almost forces regional actors to cooperate with each other. There's no payoff for being competitive with your neighbor. If you're in a designated region that's getting benefits from the EU to try to restructure, you have to cooperate with each other. That's just the way they play the game. And so this war of all against all that sometimes, characterizes what happens in the US at the local and state level really doesn't occur in Europe. And so we can learn a lot from them there, but it's got to unfold over, it's going to be decades. I mean, but you have to get started now, if not now, when?
A lot of time has passed, but maybe this still applies, that I'm thinking back to 2010 when Angela Merkel and a number of other European leaders essentially said multiculturalism had failed. And that was the headline in papers around the world. And this coincides with the rise of groups like Pegida, which was an anti-Islam populist movement. But that kind of coalesced with also the Occupy movement or the remnants thereof. And it seemed like there was this coalition of just anti-establishmentism. So can you talk maybe a little bit about that, Jeff? And then John, if you want to jump in after Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a double whammy for these regions because, as I suggested, you have, in many cases, anywhere from 30 to 40 years of secular decline, secular deindustrialization, which kind of laid the groundwork for the shock of 2008-9 with the financial crisis. And what we see in Europe initially after 2009 is a sharp populist reaction on both the left and the right, where the primary enemy was the European Union for being ineffective and for having essentially laid the groundwork for this crisis by not integrating sufficiently. You see the focus on elites in general, and then in 2015 in Europe, with the waves of migrants, of refugees coming largely from the Syrian crisis, that whole framework transforms into an anti-immigrant ethos. And this is where the right-wing populists really take the ascendancy. The left wing kind of fades in many places in Europe. And so, we're talking about almost a unique period in history that we're having to navigate through. And I will say that there is a lot of hope to find in Europe. The so-called welcoming culture, the Willkommenskultur, that Angela Merkel trumpeted in 2015. Wir schaffen das. We're gonna get through this period. We're gonna solve it. She paid for it politically, but a lot of people responded, and I would argue even a majority of Germans responded positively to that. And there are actually great examples of successful social integration of immigrant communities throughout Germany and other places in Europe, the Netherlands. But it's city by city. You can't really talk about a country having solved the problem. It's, again, we're down to the talent and innovativeness of local politicians and local officials who figure out ways to make this work.
Tony, a couple reflections on your questions recent on the East and immigrants. 3 years ago when I came to Michigan, I started out in Flint, Michigan, which is the quintessential company town. General Motors was created there. 70,000 people once worked for General Motors. Now it's down to 7,000. And when I first, they were very paternal. We in our region with these big legacy employers, and Flint's the extreme case, but a paternal employer, paternal union. If GM, the UAW, or the Mott Foundation, which is the GM funded foundation, if they weren't doing it for the community, folks had lost their entrepreneurial sense of the possible from 100 years ago. They always were looking up to be taken care of by these big paternal employers. When I first went to Berlin, where the East-West divide is so stark, and I saw the same thing, meaning the Aussies, the ones that hadn't left for the West, began to lament the lack of this paternal state that kind of at least gave them employment and healthcare and predictability. And there was the same nostalgia in both places when somebody took care of us with a decent job and some security. And that is so tremendously potent a feeling, and to prey on that nostalgia. And then when, in the Flint context or Macomb County, the famous Reagan Democrats, when it's the folks who don't have any immigrants near them who are told that their relative decline, and they're lamenting the loss of the workers' utopia that they once had, or seemed to have for a brief shining moment, is somehow the fault of immigrants. The anti-immigrant sentiments are most zealous among the white working class folks around who don't live in the city of Flint because they fled the African American community, but they live right outside in the country, and they are the voters who went even more for Donald Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016. Particularly, faulting immigrant invasions, which were nowhere near them, for kind of wrecking our country and somehow touching their lives. And the same, I think, is a phenomenon that plays in a lot of Europe as well.
Just a reminder, if you have questions or comments, you can text them to 330-541-5794. Should be on your screen there, 330-541-5794. Or you can tweet them at the City Club. My screen is already populating here. Maybe, John, if you want to take this question first. Populism seems to emerge quickly. Are there any counter-populist messages or figures who have been able to capture attention and success as quickly?
I don't know about as quickly, but I think the messaging that I certainly encourage is to basically tone down this flame throwing rhetoric, which is so destructive. It offers the wrong answer to legitimate anxieties about the future that many working class whites and, of course, people of color have lots of gaps in their opportunity that need filling, and providing the positive message of here's how we can create good jobs for you, here's how we can equip you with what you need to get a good job. And I think that kind of messaging can be successful. But our whole effort here is to focus attention on this phenomenon that if we don't accelerate and reach more people and places with economic opportunity and the chance at a decent life, they're going to keep responding to the flamethrower. So we have to attack these underlying conditions, and we have lots of good evidence, and we're putting it together to kind of illustrate the case. When communities that are just like one of these old industrial communities that lost its employment base, when they refine an economy and have a growing community and good paying jobs available, they are not voting for the Trumps of the world. Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids, Kent County, Western Michigan are examples right near me. They both lost lots of traditional manufacturing base. Kalamazoo lost its anchors. Upjohn almost closed. Pfizer bought it and then hollowed it out. They lost 40,000 good paying jobs, but they did some things as a community on their own. They kept some of that bioscience talent. They remade their downtown for be attractive, but then they created the Kalamazoo Promise, which guaranteed anyone who goes to your school district gets a free college education in Michigan. And it created an in-migration of middle-class families back in Kalamazoo. And it's growing again. And they are one of 7 counties that voted for a Democrat, and Kent County and Grand Rapids is similar. It was a Republican bastion for years, but it's a changed community. It's more diverse. It's more prosperous, and folks went for a Democrat. In our governor 3 years ago, and went for the first time for a Democrat president ever this last cycle.
Yeah, it's definitely a similar situation. Of course, in Northeast Ohio, I think of Youngstown and GM shuttering the plant in Lordstown, just outside Youngstown. And they've tried to kind of recreate themselves with Lordstown Motors and electric vehicles, and there's federal support for an innovation hub in Youngstown, which is great. But we also saw such an outflow of workers from GM because they didn't have a job anymore. They didn't know what prospects were. So there's kind of this transition period, I guess you could say, where you're trying to deal with the loss of that old industry or old employer. And you're also trying to maintain your community to be able to build something more. Do you have any thoughts on kind of that transition period, John? And maybe Jeff, if you want to take it after that.
Yeah, once any of these communities that relied on some big anchor employers that are either poof or significantly diminished because they're restructured, because it only takes 400 people to run an auto plant where it used to take 4,000 because they're running computers. You can get in a downward spiral where your tax base is eroded, and you can't keep up the parks or the roads or the water, and your community's not very attractive, and all the young people are headed for the hills. And some of our communities have been in that cycle. But I think we're encouraging, we need federally and in our states, our communities, to have place-based focus economic support strategies like the Germans, and the European Union are comfortable with, where we're going to provide disproportionate resources for communities that are in transition, I call them. That's the optimistic side versus in distress. But that could package resources for infrastructure, for job training, for small business development support, and focus that where it's needed in the places that are still not naturally on their own hoof, finding the path to success in a very different economy. And that's part of what we're pushing with the Biden administration. And some of the rhetoric and some of the policy is talking about that, when we build new infrastructure and a clean energy economy, let's really focus it on delivering for both left behind people in our cities, but also in communities and places that are left behind where workers are dislocated, and put them back to work. So we need as much of that kind of commitment on a package of education and skill building and innovation, new business development, and good paying jobs, and place-based redevelopment resources that communities that are still in that transition from old to new can use to create the conditions in their community that make it a place people want to stay and even want to come to.
Yeah, all I would add to that is that in addition to the foci and policies that John mentioned, we shouldn't forget the importance of trying to retain the younger population in the region. And one way to do that is to focus on the connection between this industrial reconversion and the community colleges. The Germans have a wonderful vocational training system that's been in place for decades. And what's fascinating is that we see throughout the United States efforts to kind of borrow and adapt that system to American conditions. The Germans don't use community colleges. They obviously have technical colleges and the like. They play a different role. But one way to kind of make the German model work in the U.S. is to bring the community college network into play. And there's some interesting things going on in the South, in particular, around some of these large plants, VW and BMW. I think that's Tennessee and South Carolina, respectively. But the similar model could be adapted here, and that at least offers a prospect to younger people who might be less inclined to head for the cities, head for where the jobs are. The mobility is so much easier in this country, which is a good thing. It gives people prospects and opportunities to reinvent themselves, but it also has a downside for communities because you can bleed out very quickly, and so it's one thing that we need to be thinking about very carefully.
Tony, can I just chime in on this point? On the good news front, Midwest writ large had a relative brain drain. We educate lots of people, our own people and others at our great colleges and universities that had been leaving for perceived greener pastures. That Midwest brain drain has just reversed, and for the first time during the last decade. There is more going on here. There are more folks involved in kind of work of the future and wanting to stay and remake their communities here. Places like Minneapolis and others had long been a talent magnet, but now, Pittsburgh, which was hemorrhaging bodies, and I'm sure, educated folks at Case Western and Ohio State used to go somewhere else, and now More of them are making their future here because we're making more of the future here.
And there has been investment, of course, in Ohio on apprenticeship programs and vocational programs. I know there's a Swiss company called SFS Intech in Medina, just south of here, which has a partnership with University of Akron, for example, just one of many examples. Get to some of these questions. Jeff, I think you might take this one back to populism. Populist politicians who are women seem to be rare in the United States and Europe. Many of those who are women, such as Marine Le Pen, have familial ties to male populist politicians, or maybe it's a regime in the case of France. What are the linkages between populism, disenfranchisement, and masculinity, would you say?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say that certainly in the European context, there are a surprising number of prominent women, at or near the top of many of these populist parties. It's a puzzle that people that I've talked to, other academics who work on this topic, are frankly kind of flummoxed by. It's not clear what's going on here. Although I will say in the case of one party where women were very prominent initially, the Alternative for Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland party, the men seem to have reasserted themselves in recent years. But then again, they're not doing a very good job of it. The party has lost a significant amount of support over the course of the pandemic. And this actually gets back to one of your earlier questions. One of the things that you can do to fight populism is actually, when you take power as a mainstream party or coalition, is get things done. Pass legislation that improve people's lives. And arguably that's what's been done in many parts of Europe. And I know they're struggling now with the vaccine rollout and the like, but for a good long time in 2020 and into 2021, many European countries, the governments in place, which were not run by populists, were showing good success in getting a grip on things, and that was reflected in the polls. The populists who were on the sidelines, jeering and shouting and pulling their hair out, were not doing very well in terms of public opinion. In part because they have no solutions. I mean, even when they're in power, they have a hard time governing. But yes, masculinity. I mean, if we're thinking about kind of appeals to nationalism, appeals to strength, appeals to ignoring the needs and the plight of others, a lack of empathy. That probably describes your stereotypical male a little better than it does your stereotypical female. But I'll probably leave it at that before I get in trouble.
That's your choice, Jeff. That's your choice. Next question. Maybe John, if you want to take this one. It is unique how similar regional patterns around former non-diversified company towns can be. Think of Janesville, Wisconsin, for example. What would you ask of local leaders to guide a consensus around a new way of thinking for diversifying the economy and recalibrating these communities?
Before I do that, the prior question, the chest thumping of the right-wing populism may be a testosterone-laden phenomenon, but someone like Elizabeth Warren is a classic, progressive populist, very strongly and clearly saying we need to redistribute some of this wealth that Jeff Bezos has so that people can afford an education and healthcare and a decent shot. So it may be a mixed bag, but perhaps the right-wing side, as Jeff noted, is more testosterone laden. I think for every company town or where your anchor employers kind of don't stay on the cutting edge of innovation and help you continue to be a thriving, job-rich economy, there are companies, towns where the anchor employer has stayed on the cutting edge of change and innovation. I think Cummins or Columbus, Indiana, we're a home of Cummins engine. It's a company town, but they're the company, financed the world's greatest architects to show their stuff every time they build a library or a civic hall, and it became an innovative architectural destination for the world's great architects. Cummins has stayed on the cutting edge of, they make big diesel engines, of clean energy, clean engines. They have more green patents and Cummins than almost any town in the Midwest. So they're competing globally. They're selling their stuff all over the world on the cutting edge of green innovation, and there are other company towns are like that. But you can't control for are your business leaders developing the model for their future that puts them where the economy is growing in all these emerging sectors of, clean energy, smart water solutions, sustainable practices. But you can, and there's no substitute for when your civic and business and political leadership doesn't get together and have some leadership where you can identify what assets do we have to work with, what long-term strategies should we try to organize around based on what we've got to work with in our community, where they do come together and they do kind of run a plan. They can execute, and they can, over the medium term and the long term, create a more diverse economic landscape by leveraging what assets they have and putting some energy and money and getting help they need from the states and the feds. I think Green Bay, Wisconsin has leveraged its location, cleaned up their mess on the Great Lake. It has the Packers. They're working with Microsoft on kind of a tech incubator, leveraging the Microsoft or the Packers brand and redeveloping relationships to advance competitiveness of their manufacturing sector with their engineering talent at University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And other communities around the region can identify their strategic assets and how they can leverage them. But you have to have some leadership that can work together, public-private, and run a plan. And we're trying to illustrate in our work and some of the writings and publications we've already shared, like the Vital Midwest report that we put out from the Chicago Council. There are many different success paths for similarly situated older industrial communities that look just like us, and how they find new success and learning from each other, being inspired by another community's example, like what Milwaukee has done, or what some of these other communities have done to move from old to new. That's how we think we can share and help each other, both here in this country and across the Atlantic, where we have a lot to learn from them, and they have a lot to learn from us.
This question, John, maybe if you want to start and then Jeff jump in. Do you have thoughts on the infrastructure bill bubbling in Congress? What impact do you think it will have on Rust Belt economies? And do you think it might calm nationalistic tendencies or more extreme politicization of some of these investments, or is it just going to be business as usual?
Well, I have an article in Newsweek today about a big infrastructure plan could deliver hugely for our Midwest, both economically by, again, being central to extend kind of economic participation to more rural and small town communities where now people fleeing the coast, might want to post up on a Great Lake and live and work in a quality of life place. But it's got to be wired to play in the world as a business and as an individual, and deliver connectivity for folks in our cities so that they can learn, have a chance to participate. Obviously, putting people to work, building the retrofitting for green and sustainable smart energy systems and products and buildings and schools, can be a huge contributor just to boots on the ground job creation. But what I point out is, yes, and then in doing so, it will bring some opportunity to folks who are otherwise maybe not finding a place in today's economy, and could, again, treat polarized politics by helping more people find a little hope and then a little optimism that, yes, we can make it. And then they're able to look around and not be so encouraged to think that that they're threatened by change. They're succeeding in a world. And so it could be a huge boon for us. And as I noted in the article, Europeans have done this for a long time. When they're trying to balance growth between regions, one of the first things and one of those tangible things, we're going to run high-speed trains and infrastructure to connect and allow to be connected, less developed to the higher developed, corridor. And it's exactly what we should be doing here.
Yeah, and all I would add is, the need for speed was paramount in this case, and so um, there's every reason to believe. I haven't looked at the bill per se, but there's every reason to believe that states and localities are going to have a fair amount of flexibility in how they make use of these funds, and this is where initiatives like John's Midwest, Vital Midwest, and others play such an important role. That you've had ongoing discussions for many years between and among states, between and among localities, to try to develop a kind of regional consciousness about what's needed for the totality of the economic space that we're talking about. And the reason that's important is every one of these places is different. And so the same cookie cutter approach to infrastructure is not going to work everywhere. It has to be kind of adapted to local needs and local potentials. This notion of a place-specific or place-based aid that John talked about earlier. And I'm really optimistic about many parts of the country. And what I'm hoping is that the success stories that are inevitable here, we have a way of publicizing that and transmitting that so that other regions of the United States can kind of get in the game and understand that if you cooperate, you actually get ahead of things. It's not every man jack for himself in this spatial economy that we live in and work in.
I'd like each of you to answer this. Maybe Jeff first, and I'm gonna morph this question. So if the questioner's watching, please forgive me. What do you think about the future of work? Because during this pandemic, we have been rethinking how we do events, how we're connecting with coworkers, how we're thinking about what we want work to be, where we spend our time, how we accomplish it. Is there an opportunity for communities like Youngstown, for example, to become some sort of bedroom community or remote worker community, which could serve a mid-sized city metropolis like Cleveland, but anywhere really, because of this rethinking of what work is now?
The short answer is yes, and then absolutely with a big exclamation point at the end. I think here government can lead the way, ironically, and business will too, because there are economies to be realized here by decentralizing and by getting rid of office tower blocks with 4,000 people in them and so on. But I think both the federal government and the state governments are in a position to also lead by example and think about decentralizing some of their operations in ways that don't just benefit, say, the region where I live, DC, Maryland, Virginia, but parts of the country that have lost jobs in recent decades and are looking for new footholds, because a lot of what generates growth also revolves around government. I know that sounds like a kind of a bad word, but the fact is, the Europeans have been very good about using the public sector to kind of shape the way the private sector then forms around it, and to use it as a way of getting at these spatial disparities in income and growth and opportunity. So I think that's a great question by the questioner, and I expect big things to be happening based on the lessons we've learned over this last 18 months.
Any
Tony,
thoughts, John?
there were two forces that were already working pre-COVID. One was a knowledge economy. You're working in offices in front of computers, and the bigger metros overall was where the action was, and kind of smaller communities that a plant or a factory or a mill were being left behind. And that may be that may be changing a bit as some of the tech talent is happy to flee Berkeley and California and wants to live in a nice quality of life place. And it's happening that places with a rich quality of life and place, if they're connected to the world, we're already seeing professionals poached up there. I think Marquette, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula, which was the iron ore transshipment place. It was growing again because they wired it to the world and they cleaned up their mess. And it's a great lifestyle, historic community on Lake Superior that's just beautiful. Has a university. They've seen growth even before the pandemic, and that opportunity for more of our communities to leverage their unique place and quality of place may be accelerated. But also in another dimension, the pandemic is accelerating certain changes to the nature of work, more automation, more automated systems, materials handlers. But I'm a great believer that, it's not inevitable versus created, because as we're already seeing, for every automated warehouse worker that's job is gone, there's a new one making this robot delivery vehicle, designing, coding, and training. There's a gal on a scooter following this robot delivery vehicle that we're going to hopefully be making all of those in the world with our abilities right outside my window every day in Ann Arbor. And there's lots of work to do and things to make as the world changes. Look at who made the medical products and protective devices and even the vaccines. Pfizer is kicking out. They only had a couple hundred people at their manufacturing facility in Kalamazoo. Now, mean the thing that's saving us all. And hopefully we won't need all of that type of thing. But there's work changes and new opportunities are created as others are disappearing.
A final question before we wrap up, and maybe this is a big one, but John, maybe you take it first and then Jeff. But I wonder, what is it going to take to stop the weaponization of the industrial Midwest? We see this in election cycles that, you can call it the blue wall or you can call it, Trump country, but it seems like it is a profile of a person who is looking for opportunity and they can't find it. So they're latching on to hope in whatever term that is. So do you think this is just going to be a perpetual part of our politics, or is there a way to break out of this and start thinking about our communities in different terms as just political commodities, but as things to be fostered and to grow new opportunity, maybe? So John and then Jeff. Yeah.
Yes, and this is a deliberate choice non-leaders or bad leaders are making to prey on the understandable anxieties about the future and change for lots of particularly working class folks of all backgrounds, but speaking to working class whites and saying, we're going to bring back your status and the good old days, and we're going to blame and get rid of all these immigrants and other people that are threatening you. That's a choice of how to prey on those understandable anxieties. And we can, and good leaders, make a different choice. And I think President Biden is doing a decent job of this, saying no, to build on some of that understandable nostalgia, but say, look, we're America. We can do this. We can do big things. We can create new good jobs, good paying jobs for you. And here's how to go about doing it. And so deliver an answer to understandable concerns and hopes and dreams and worries, but an answer that is the right answer, not a destructive answer that leads to this undermining of our democracy, in such horrifying ways when folks you encourage, attack our nation's capital. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's leaders who choose to offer the destructive message versus a constructive message that gives hope and is a vision for where we can go as use this American exceptionalism. It's true. We can do big things. We've done them before. We can create new good jobs in all the coming sectors. You need leadership that will help that to happen.
Yeah, that a very good question. And I, as a political scientist, I guess I'm going to fall back on the importance of institutions here. I mean, one of the reasons that I think the Midwestern states find themselves in the unfortunate political situation they do is the Electoral College. I mean, the Electoral College turns this into, a battleground every 2 years, not just every 4 years. So it's like a perpetual election campaign. And the great irony is that, in terms of benefits from the federal government, the Midwest really hasn't done that well, despite its centrality to both political parties. And so how do you break that cycle? Well, I think, along the lines of what John just said, if the Democrats are able to get traction on these big issues and deliver something finally for all the people of the Midwest, not just the ones who voted for Joe Biden, but all of them, all of the communities, or as many as possible, and people start then voting by rewarding those kinds of policies, I think it leaves the opposition party very little choice but to follow suit and to start talking about substance and not about culture and loss and honor and all this other stuff that you hear in the election campaigns of today. But that's a big ticket item. It's not clear that it will work, but I think it's frankly the only way that it will work. And so, that's one of the reasons we're doing this, is because one of the authors that we followed in this discussion talks about the revenge of the places that don't matter. And this author believes very strongly that these places do matter, but politically they haven't mattered. And they're taking their revenge. And so, we need to listen to that. And I think part of what we're trying to do is put this issue on the map for policymakers at all levels of society.
Well, thank you for that. I think we're definitely on a map. This was a fantastic conversation. And thank all of you for joining us for tonight's virtual Happy Dog Takes on the World Forum. We've been talking about the transatlantic effort to diminish the appeal of populism, revitalize Rust Belt economies, and restore democracy. We, of course, were joined by Dr. Jeffrey Anderson of Georgetown University, also John C. Austin, director of the Michigan Economic Center and a non-resident senior fellow at both the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Brookings Institution. Happy Dog Takes on the World is presented with the support of an anonymous donor and is a collaborative effort between the City Club of Cleveland, Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Happy Dog, the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle Eastern Studies, and IdeaStream. We sure do appreciate the partnership. All of City Club's virtual forums are presented for free every week, thanks to generous support from Bank of America, Key Bank, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and PMC. You can learn more about contributing at thecityclub.org. Join us on May 4th as Happy Dog Takes on the World discusses the decade of war in Syria with Robert Ford, former ambassador to Syria, U.S. ambassador, and Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, former ambassador to Malta. I am Tony Ganser. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Our forum is now ended. Have a good night.